Good evening, everyone. You are watching Mario's History Talks. I'm Mario Rostovsky, and we have a terrific show for you this evening. So, since we have last seen each other, as expected, quite a lot has gone down. And of course, we see more of the meltdowns, but more so from the Bulgarian side now, including one Bulgarian newspaper that actually took the time to launch an investigation into good old Mario Rostovsky. In addition to that, we also have one Bulgarian member of the European Parliament personally messaging me on Facebook to call me an Albanian. And the result of all this? Well, my Bulgar fans have succeeded in gaining me so many watch hours, so much exposure. My channel is officially eligible for monetization. So, thank you, my friends. I really wasn't trying for this, but you know, you're spending hours trying to spam me, discredit me, and investigate me. You actually succeeded in actually just putting money into my pocket. And you thought it was UMD and Gruevski that was paying me to do this? Rise and shine, sonny boy. It's actually you. So, thank you once again. Now, for today's episode, we will be tackling a doozy. We will be going over and methodically debunking Ivan Mikhailov's 15 points that prove the supposed Bulgarianness of Macedonians. This, in many ways, constitutes the 10, or I should say 15, commandments for the Bulgarian nationalists online. Every single one of their points is just, in fact, recycled, rehashed, and repackaged from a point that Mihailov penned down earlier in this essay. Yes, this is the same exact Mihailov whose fanatical pro-Bulgarian views destroyed the credibility of Vamoro amongst Macedonians and essentially drove it into the ground. Great start, you guys. What can I say? So with that, let's get started. So of course, this is the first point for the Bulgars, and we have covered this in great depth. As a reminder, in contemporary sources, Byzantines referred to Samial state, as well as its inhabitants, as either Scythians, Mesians, barbarians, or simply foreigners, not ethnic Bulgarians. In fact, Basil's own epitaph on his grave testifies to the fact that he did not consider his fight against Samuel to be fight against Bulgarians, as we see reference to the Scythians. In fact, by that point, Basil would have been known simply as Basil Porphyrogenitus, Basil born of the purple. Basil II was not called Basil the Bulgar Slayer until many centuries after his death, when the territory of Samial state was now known as the theme of Bulgaria. And of course, this Bulgar Slayer nickname was actually not used in reference to his battle with Samuel. It's a little bit retroactively used, but it was actually used to resurrect the fear and the image of Basil against the new enemies of the Byzantine Empire, the Vlacho-Bulgarians. After the Byzantines reconquered the territory of Macedonia, all inhabitants living there, regardless of ethnicity, all the way from Macedonia to even parts of Serbia that were under the jurisdiction of the Ohrid Archbishopric, were called Bulgarians because they were part of the theme of Bulgaria, which was named as such because of the Byzantines' desire to show ideological continuity in granting the Ohrid Archbishopric Church its legitimacy. So, as we know, Greek archbishops that were sent to the Ohrid Archbishopric, they were called Bulgarians after they were sent there. But furthermore, in contemporary sources, Byzantines still felt the need to qualify the ethnic origins of the people that they now called Bulgarians. So, for example, we have references to St. Clement stating that he was born a European Mesian, but was now known as Bulgarian. Weird how you can essentially be born out of one ethnicity but magically morph into another practically overnight. And remember, this is the legacy of the theme of Bulgaria. I mean, the famous Ottoman explorer Vilija Čelebi, he said he found Bulgarians in 17th century Belgrade. Ah yes, another great point by Vancho here. This is the same as we've heard before. And let's see how Bulgarian he actually was based on what we know to be the modern Bulgarian national identity. So this is a speech that the great Bulgarian Grigor Perlichev gave at the men's high school St. Cyril and Methodius in Solun on the 1000th anniversary of the death of St. Methodius. He said, and I quote, "Mother Macedonia is very weak after giving birth to the great Alexander, after giving birth to the saints Cyril and Methodius. Since then, Mother Macedonia has been lying on her bed, terribly exhausted. But a mother who gave birth to such sons will give birth to others like them in the future, and will produce many more Kirillov'S and Metodiev'S, who will be beacons of our schools and our pillars of faith, and who will celebrate the Macedonian name." And further on, he says, "It is not a great shame for the Macedonians, who once conquered the world through Alexander the Great, who, after baptizing millions of Slavs through Saints Cyril and Methodius and enlightening them, that today we should be the lowest of the whole world in enlightenment." This, to me, I don't know about you folks, this sounds like a typical Bulgarian, right in what we know to be the national sense today. Just like the ones on Facebook that make fun of us for celebrating the ancient Macedonians and call us antichki, to ridicule us. Grigor Perlichev, he's the exact same as those people online. And also, let's not forget the fact that Perlichev, in his own autobiography, he stated that he didn't even know how to write in proper Bulgarian, as defined by the modern Bulgarian state. Let's actually take a look. He said, "And because I could not write in Bulgarian, I wrote in Old Bulgarian." By this he means Church Slavonic. Another quote, in the store of Angela Grubchev, which served as a reading room, I learned Bulgarian reading and writing. And furthermore, he states, "I was and still am weak in the Bulgarian language." Don't worry, Grigor, so am I. Ah yes, the Miladinovs. Not only did we discuss the fact that Konstantin Miladinov explicitly stated in a letter that they chose to call the works Bulgarian because he was worried that the use of the name Macedonia without any kind of qualifiers would result in much unneeded attention from the Greeks. But we also remember they actually had to buy Bulgarian folk songs from Vasil Chulakov to even make the name Bulgarian. In fact, out of 677 songs, only 77 are Bulgarian. And as we discovered before, the brothers Miladinov, they called their language Pelazgo-Slavic. They called their nationality Pelasgian. They explicitly made differentiation in their works between Makedonsky Tsarevi and Bulgarsky Tsarevi. And they even collected songs and stories about Alexander the Great, who they considered to be their ancestor when they were talking to the Greeks in Athens. Now, does this sound to you like they have a firm grasp on what it means to be a Bulgarian based on our modern nationalistic understanding of that identity? And in other letters, they make references to saying Mie Makedonchinata and specifically stating Makedonsky Pesni. But, of course, given all this, we still can't discount the fact that both brothers were originally ardent Hellenists before coming into contact with the Russian pan-Slavicist Grigorovich, who undoubtedly swayed their notions of what their self-identity constituted and how they chose to identify themselves, as he was eager to resurrect a Slavic, pan-Bulgarian identity in the Balkans, and as a way to expand Russian influence. And remember, Russian pan-Slavicists at this time period assumed the Bulgarians were fully a Slavic tribe, but they were actually a Russian Slavic tribe from the Volga River, and that's where they got their name. And of course, the Volga River is in Russia. Now, notice the sleight of hand that Vancho plays here. He goes on to extrapolate that by identifying their language as Bulgarian, these two Macedonians also would have had a Bulgarian national consciousness. Now, we know that the national consciousness of Macedonians did not even start really until the mid-1800s, and not even taking full form until the late 1800s. So it's absolutely ludicrous for Bulgarians, as well as Macedonians, to claim victories before this time period, as there was simply little to no notion of national nor ethnic identity. The use of the word Bulgarian to describe their language was undoubtedly a relic of the past, as Miladinov perfectly put it, both from the legacy of the Bulgarian Empire, in which Macedonian Slavic literacy first flourished, but also the Byzantine administrative theme of Bulgaria, which would see Macedonians en masse referred to by outsiders as Bulgarians for centuries. Also, remember, by this time period, Macedonians were still calling, largely speaking, the actual Bulgars shopi, and would have had little to no contact with them. And remember, all the letters, that the Bulgarians state are just artificial creations by the Serbomans and the communists that constitute our alphabet today. Yeah, they both happen to be found in Pejčinović's work. Pretty weird, huh? I guess Tito got to him too. Now, this is why you should not trust history to gangsters like Mihailov. Theophylact was a Greek from Epirus, and upon being transferred to the theme of Bulgaria, he too considered himself, get this, to be Bulgarian as well as the inhabitants. Ethnic origin did not matter, as this was a Byzantine ecclesiastical and administrative division. For all intents and purposes, the people there were Bulgarians. And remember, at this time period, the actual Bulgarians were seldom called Bulgarians. I mean, the theme of Bulgaria almost had a monopoly over that name. So, first things first. We cannot even definitively confirm that Father Paisi was actually from Bansko in Pirin, Macedonia. This seems to be a state of fact and ingrained in the modern Bulgarian historiography that essentially the Bulgarian national awakening began in Macedonia. But we actually don't have a whole lot of definitive evidence that points to this. Bulgarian researcher Tsanko Živkov, he points out that in Paisi's famous work, The Slavo-Bulgarian History, almost none of the dialectal words are actually from the Bansko region, but they actually lean more towards the village of Kraljev Dvor in the Pernik region of Bulgaria. But not only this, but the evidence used to actually support the thesis that he was born in Bansko is actually built upon some more recent and actually admittedly controversial evidence. And this was not even seen as his birthplace until well into the late 30s. Before that, Kraljev Dvor had that honor. But I'm going to get more into that in the future. But still, I can admit, even if he was born in Macedonia, I can concede this. But the question remains, why would he famously shout that Bulgarians should not be afraid to speak their Bulgarian language and call themselves Bulgarians? Well, if you actually do read into the text and kind of contextualize it, you'll see that Paisi, he actually had a conceptualization of the term Bulgarian much different than what we know and understand today. Not only did he essentially completely Slavicize the early Bulgarian kings and gave them actually Serbian sounding names like Vukic and Dragic, far cry from Asparuh and Omartug, but to him, the contrast between Greek and Bulgarian was that of the difference between a peasant sheep herder and a wealthy merchant city dweller, not entirely based off of ethnic differences alone. In fact, given this and other generally observed phenomena concerning the fluidity of identities during this time period, we have anthropologists like Danforth, we have linguists like Friedman, and we have historians like Detries, who essentially help explain the identities like Greek, Turk, Vlach, or Bulgarian of the time period by essentially showing that they're not so much based off of ethnic divisions, but more so rooted in economic and social divisions, whereby, depending on your trade and even your circumstances, you could very theoretically have been born an ignorant Bulgarian peasant, and if you entered the merchant class, you would have become a middle-class merchant Greek. And by this point, you would have started sending your children to a Greek school and a Greek church, and you would have started speaking Greek and believed yourself to have been Greek. And this is precisely what Brailsford saw in his travels to Macedonia in the early 1900s, where he was puzzled how one man could father sons and one could become Bulgarian, while the other Greek, depending on their village and their priest and their church. Of course, this also includes their trade. So what was taking place here was not necessarily a change of ethnic identities, as modern historiography would have us believe, but more so of class. And this is how Paisi saw his world and what he was commenting on through his dominant Christian moral lens of the world. Now, this has been discussed ad nauseum already. Here are, of course, a couple of points that Vancho forgot to mention. Most of Macedonia at this point was essentially illiterate and made up of peasants, with no concept of neither nationalism nor national identity outside their region or their local village. To most Macedonians, their identity would have simply been Christian or Raya in Turkish. Now, unfortunately, most of the Macedonians' history, they actually have relegated to be, written and spread by foreigners, outside politicians, or even small cut-off elites within their own society that essentially define their identity for the rest of the world. And the fact is that while most of the great powers did assume nonchalantly that the Slavs of Macedonia were Bulgarians, this was not necessarily reflective of the situation with the majority of the population, the peasantry. Remember, these are people that would say such contradictory things such as, well, we are Macedonians, but by the church, we are Bulgarians. And at other times, they would call themselves either, Macedonski Bulgari or Slavo Macedonski Bulgari, and they would turn around and say that they're descendants of Alexander the Great, and they can't actually understand the spoken language of Bulgarians in Bulgaria. Okay, so in an era where Russia was concerned with gaining access to the Aegean Sea, do you really think, Vancho Mihailov, that Russia at all cared about what the ethnic identities were of the people that lived there in their proposed state? Has the West ever really cared what the ethnic identities were? The Russians set out as early as the 1840s to resurrect the Bulgarian identity in the Balkans and essentially prove the Slavic character of both the Bulgarian empires as well as Samuel's state. And having a Macedonian state alongside a Serbian one and a Bulgarian one and whatever one they wanted to resurrect obviously would have complicated things quite a bit from Russia in a geopolitical sense, having multiple smaller states and ethnicities to control. But since Russia did consider itself as the origin of the so-called Slavic Bulgars, Slavic, right? They actually had a keen interest in proving the Bulgarianness of the Slavic inhabitants of Thrace, Mysia, and Macedonia. And Macedonia, they connected it directly to Samuel Sate to provide this thesis. And of course, this was also a time when educated Macedonians and Bulgarians would have considered themselves to be Greeks and actually spoke Greek, while the peasantry would have had, like I said, little to no understanding of ethnic identities the way Russia and the West actually envisioned it. So, it was mainly due to Russian influence that Macedonians, like the brothers Miladinov or Grigor Perlichev, began to actually de-Hellenize themselves. Before this point, like I said, they would have actually been predominantly speaking and writing in Greek. However, since we are also speaking in Russia, let's take a look at a primary source from Russia from 1756 on the ethnicity of the Russian Imperial Army. Notice anything? I'll let you figure that one out. Again, Bulgarians will continue to spin this and blast the internet with their translations of source material like the Mihailov's letter or others, as if it were just the end-all, be-all proof on the nationality of the entire nation of the Macedonians. And of course, the Bulgarians will counter that and say, but who forced them? Who forced them to call themselves Bulgarians? Really? Really? As if any attempt to push forward a distinct Macedonian, even quasi-identity, wasn't harshly denounced by the Bulgarian government as separatist. It's as if Petko Slavekov wasn't complaining to the Exarch Joseph in Istanbul that the Macedonists were undermining the Bulgarian design for Macedonia by claiming that they were actually not Bulgarians. Or it's as if the Bulgarian government didn't clamp down and shut out of existence the Loza Association magazine as being separatist for the crime of choosing to write in the local Macedonian dialect rather than the Eastern-based dialect that would become the Bulgarian standard literary language. And to the Macedonians, this language was largely foreign. And it's almost, and I'm almost done here, it's almost as if all these revolutionaries mentioned were not brought up and employed by the Bulgarian extricate schools, and were not walking around eggshells to continue to use Bulgaria for military and financial aid. Yes, Vancho, they had absolutely no pressure to declare themselves proud ethnic Bulgarians. And notice, for all the commenters, I did not actually state that these individuals all necessarily saw themselves as being ethnic Macedonians. Again, that identity was not fully developed. All I'm saying is the conditions were not right nor practical to further a separate Macedonian ethnic identity at this time. Context again proves our ally here. The liberation and autonomy of Macedonia was the critical objective here that surpassed all others. We have evidence of early Macedonian influence, as well as debates to the general character and direction of the Macedonian liberation movement. However, as I said before, and as Rossos also rightly points out, despite all the seemingly contradictory views on the identity of Macedonians and the direction of the Macedonian movement, this was simply a point that was tabled and left to be determined in the future. It was simply more pragmatic to work for the liberation of Macedonia under the auspices of the Bulgarian identity. This was an identity that was recognized by the world. It had a church and it had a state backing it. To advocate for the liberation of Macedonia, while also simultaneously working to recognize a Macedonian language and identity of what was essentially a vacuum at that point, and usher this in through the channels of the Ottoman Empire and the rest of the world, this simply would not have been feasible. You have to start somewhere, and autonomy for Macedonia was the place to start. And what's important here, though, is both Vlachov and Sandanski were both adamantly opposed to any Bulgarian intrusion and interference into the internal matters related to the liberation of Macedonia. As Vlachov said, the Macedonian movement is neither Greek, nor Bulgarian, nor Serbian, but only Macedonian. And Sandanski, of course, he said in his famous letter to Melnik, he said that they were actually fighting for a Macedonia for the Macedonians, not a Bulgarian Macedonia. Again, look at their deeds. Don't just listen to their words exclusively. These are, more times than not, largely political means to an end, which is, of course, the liberation of Macedonia. Now, we must remember that since 1870, the population of Macedonia did fall under the influence and the sway of the Bulgarian Exarchate Church. I'm going to get into this in just a couple of moments. Now, this was in contrast, of course, to being part of the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which aimed to Hellenize them, often by force. So, the idea the area was free from Bulgarian influence, absolutely laughable. And within the Ottoman Empire, one was, of course, identified based on their religious identity, not so much their ethnic identity. This was referred to as the Millet system. Now, since the Ottoman conquest and until really the rise of Greek nationalism in the 1800s, this saw, of course, the adoption of the term Roman, synonymous, of course, with being Greek. Now, the Roman Millet, this was used in reference to most of the Balkan Christians at this time period as a result, in the context of being part of the Rum Millet as being Christian. So they were essentially Rumelian, if you want to think of it like that. Now, likewise, when we saw the religious Bulgarian Millet take place, the Macedonians now became known as Bulgarians. And as a result of this, the reason that Vlachov went as a representative of the Bulgarian population of southern Macedonia is that he belonged to the Bulgar Millet. It's as simple as that. They had to use the framework and the political structure that was at their feet at that point. There was simply no other way to go about this. And we know from Vlachov's work, he was pro-Macedonian, and he even went to have a career within Yugoslavia, which, for the Bulgarians, was just simply anathema, completely unforgivable. You would have been canceled out by the Bulgarians quicker than having taken a walk through a modern-day college campus. Absolutely ridiculous. Again, a classic sleight of hand here. So, not only is there really no context nor source provided here, but it also neglects to state the obvious, what the term Bulgarian meant in a pre-exarchate, pre-national sense, and how this would have been interpreted. Now, as a primary battle at this time period was actually ideological, waged in the churches, namely the Greek Patriarchate Church in Constantinople, that sought to re-Hellenize the Macedonians back to their supposed Greek heritage. Remember, Greeks that actually believed the Macedonians to be Macedonians, but Greeks at this time period. The battle at this time period was essentially between Slavic and Hellenic, or to use the more appropriate medieval-rooted terminologies, Vulgaroi and Romanoi. Now, the Slavic-speaking Vulgaroi, they of course would be the ideological descendants of the Bulgarian Empire, and the Greek-speaking Romanoi would have come from the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire. Yes, now both these identities do undoubtedly stem from real ethnic groups, the Turkic Bulgars and the Italic Romans. But these identities have long since been reimagined and repackaged social and political categories. And the commentators of this time period were aware of this. That's precisely why Stefan Verković, the Bosnian Serb who traveled to Macedonia and in the 1850s compiled the anthology called the folk songs, the national songs of the Macedonian Bulgarians, he stated that when he chose the word Bulgarian, this represented a political identity and not an ethnic one. He specifically stated these words. Yes, the Macedonians did vote overwhelmingly to join the newly recognized, the newly established Bulgarian Exarchate Church in the 1870s. True, no one really forced them in this. But again, let's remember that up until this point, they were under extreme and often brutal, violent Hellenization pressure from the Greek Patriarchate Church in Constantinople. At this stage, this would have been the first chance that these Macedonian Slavs would have had to have a Slavic-speaking church and clergy that actually recognized them for what they were, not Greeks. I mean, there was simply no other choice at this time period. But even then, let's not forget the opposition Macedonians actually would have still had, even with the establishment of the Bulgarian Exarchate Church, going as far as to consider the Uniate movement, which actually did take place in Macedonia, as a reconciliation between the Orthodox and the Catholics to essentially re-establish the autonomous Ohrid Archbishopric Church, as revolutionaries like Dimitar Pope-Georgiev Berovsky advocated for, as well as the Metropolitan Theodosius of Skopje in his letter to the Pope in 1891. Yes, some Macedonians did, of course, completely accept the Bulgarian Exarchate Church and would go on to create a Bulgarian national identity and believe it through and through. However, this was a small and educated elite that was oftentimes employed by the church itself. For most peasants who had little to no understanding of nationality, they would have this would have been their chance to be part of a Slavic-speaking church, and they would go on to identify as Bulgarian precisely because of membership in that church and, of course, in that Millet. But also, let's take a look at some more context here. Here is a newspaper article from the Istanbul-based Bulgarian newspaper called Macedonia, run by our favorite friend Petko Slaveykov, where the author of this anonymous article, he essentially writes right after the establishment of the Bulgarian Exarchate Church that despite the Macedonians overwhelmingly joining the church, he still says that there are still two people. The Macedonians and the Bulgarians are still two nations, and this fact should be recognized and accepted and taken into consideration moving forward. There it is again, the famous Beetle inscription. If we had a college-based party game for every time we heard this reference, we would not be able to speak by now. As we discussed in the last episode, we don't know for sure whether the Beetle inscription was actually written by Ivan Mihailov, number one. And of course, the Bulgars want us to accept it as an absolute bulletproof truth, just simply no doubt nor possibility of anything else. And of course, we have seen there are many credible researchers and linguists that have serious pause and reservations about Zaimov's filled-in text as well as the certainty over its dating. And as we saw from the previous episode, ethnicity was simply not a factor in declaring oneself to be either Roman or Bulgarian, or even Macedonian for that matter, whatever that might have meant then. We have the Turco-Vlachs Peter and Asen declaring themselves to be Bulgarians, while Basil I, an Armenian, goes down to found the Macedonian dynasty. And now, based off this, we are to assume that Samuel, whom researchers point to either an Armenian or a local Bursiak Slavic background, is just somehow the exception to this rule, and this man was 100% Bulgar. But remember, folks, every time you hear or read the word Bulgarian, no matter the context, no matter their period, no matter what the person actually thought of themselves, what they thought their heritage was, what they thought their identity was, it always, and I mean always, affirms exclusively attachment to the modern day Bulgarian identity. However, if you see the word Bulgar, be careful. These are not the same people as the modern day Bulgarians. And that kind of rhetoric, that is hate speech. And I'm not going to tolerate that on my show. So, well, unfortunately for Vansha and the Bulgarians, I have answered these rather amateur questions with relative ease. To all the Bulgarian internet warriors who think we just bury our heads in the sand or, just completely implode internally when you remind us of these facts, it's pretty laughable. I mean, you really do live in a tunnel. I mean, you memorize these little bullet points or even factoids, not even complete paragraphs like, did you know that Basil was called the Bulgar Slayer? Bet you didn't know that. Did you know that the name of Yanis Andinsky's political party was the Federative Party Bulgarian section? I got you there. No, you don't. No, you don't. Every single fact, not only have I heard before, but you're just memorizing and you're regurgitating these little BuzzFeed style bullet points, and you're wasting your life copying and pasting them online to essentially prove a point. And all you're doing is you're monetizing my work. So thank you. But remember, there's still 8 degrees of separation from you, these commenters, and any original thought into this. Everything you think is the truth, that the Komunisti, the Srbomani, and Josip Broz Tito, and God knows who else, just kept buried from us and want us to not know about, we do know. And it just shows your head is buried in the sand. But keep commenting on my videos. I'm not going to stop you. Keep having your journalists and your politicians breathe down my neck. You're only making it that much easier for me. But in the meantime, of course I didn't forget you. To my Macedonians and non-Macedonian viewers alike, I love you all the same. Please comment and subscribe. We are making traction. Stay safe. Have a healthy and happy Christmas and a happy New Year's. I'm going to see you again soon. Keep fighting for Macedonia. I'm going to see you in the New Year's. Srećan Božić, Hristos se rodi, Srećna Nova Godina.